Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Nun Tet. This is the daf for Shabbat. We have a super interesting daf, very famous daf. The second half of the daf will be mostly the story of Tanurosh Shel Achnai, which if you're not familiar with, then it's great you're learning it. If you are familiar with, maybe we will shed some light on the story that you haven't heard before. If not, it will be good review. So let's get started from the bottom of Nun Chet Amud Bet, the last few words. We ended with saying that there's three things: sleeping with a married woman, embarrassing someone in public, and calling someone a name, a not nice nickname, even if they don't really care, but it's still not appropriate. And those three things are so bad that they will cause you to go down into hell and you will not be able to come out of it. And we talked about that perhaps it's because you don't even realize how severe it is, at least the second two, and you don't even think that you need to repent. So now we're going to go to Amar Rabbi Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the very end of the daf, starting now from the top of Nun Tet. So Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as having said the following statement: Noach lo la'adam she'yavo al safek eshet ish va'al yabim pnei chavero b'rabim. If you have to choose, better not to get yourself into a situation where perhaps you're going to sleep with a woman who is perhaps a married woman, than to embarrass a friend in public. Okay, some people say it's even if it's a definite eshet ish. In other words, if you're going to put those two on the scale, humiliating someone in public is way worse. Now, I think they use this example. Again, this is all promotional statements. These are scare tactics, we can call them. They're ways to get people to avoid doing this. And as you can imagine, if it's common nowadays for people to do this, it was obviously common in those as well. People generally speak to other people not always in the best of ways. And therefore, the rabbis want to say, this is very serious. Take it seriously. Minala, where do we get this from? Kimida Darish Rava, because Rava darshan the following pasuk in Tehillim. My dechtivu b'tzal'i samchu v'ne'asaf. Tzal'i is with my limping. People were happy and they gathered together. Kar'u v'lo damu. They tore and they weren't silent. Amar David l'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now they're going to darshan this pasuk. Tzal'i, Rashi quotes, isn't just limping, but also tzela is a rib. And women, right? When man and women were created, the woman was taken from the rib of man. So basically, the Gemara said, Rashi says, that's why this pasuk is a reference to my tzal'i, my rib, my wife, Batsheva, who, originally it started out not exactly appropriate, where he stole her from Uriah Hittite. So Amar, again, how that story came about and the details and what the rabbis did with that story, I'm putting all that aside. But Amar David Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If they would tear my flesh, it wouldn't cause blood to spill. They're using the word dom, which means to be silent, and changing it to dam. It wouldn't have blood come out. Basically what he's saying is I'm very strong and you won't bother me. But the fact is, in other words, what happened? They were rejoicing by making fun of David HaMelech, about his tzal'i, about his wife, Batsheva, and what he did. Okay, here's the drasha. Even when you're learning Hilchot Niga'im about leprosy, which could be connected to the fact that leprosy is a sin, according to the tradition, for Lashon Hara. And Ohalot, another explanation of why specifically these two things, that's Tumat Met. These are both very complicated topics and they require a lot of focus. So even while you're sitting learning and supposedly focusing on your learning, Omrimli, they say to me, David, and they would say to me, David, what happens to a man who sleeps with a married woman? What death does he get? And I say to them the following. In other words, they were all mocking David. And David says, right, this is Onat Varim. David says, he gets strangulation. But you know what? He has a place in the world to come because he can repent, and that's what I did. I repented. Aval, and then he adds, but someone who humiliates someone in public has no place in the world to come. So you think you're mocking me for what I did. What you're doing is way worse. Amar Marzutra Bar Tuvia Amar Rav, another statement quoted now by Rav. Some people quote the name of Rabbi Shimon Chasida. And some people say Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan quoted in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Better put yourself in a fiery furnace. And don't humiliate a friend in public. Okay, this is, again, another comparison. Better to do this than that. This actually makes it seem like this should be on the list of Yareg Val Yavor, which we're going to get to when we get to Sanhedrin, of the 3 sins that you have to let yourself be killed rather than transgress. And this is not one of them. Some of the commentaries say, why is this not there? Again, you always get different opinions anyway about which, what's at the top there. And again, this could be just a promotional statement, not to be taken 100% literally. Minalam, where do we get this from? Mitamal. We learn it from Tamar and Yehuda. If you remember what happens here, Dichtiv hi mutzeit, she was supposed to be taken out to be burned, because Yehuda said, right, that she should be burned. Vihi shachal chamia. And she, what did she do? Instead of parading in public and saying, oh, look whose items I have, it's Yehuda, and look who slept with me. Instead, she did it quietly by sending it to him, right? Quietly. Therefore, she didn't humiliate him. And here you see, she'd rather have been burned than humiliate Yehuda. Amar Rav Chanina bered Rav Idi. My dachtiva lo tonu ishet amito. Another drasha on the pasuk. This is about onat varim. Don't abuse people with words, verbal abuse. Am sheitcha b'torah v'mitzvot al tonehu. Why amito and not achiv? When it came to onat mamon, it said achiv. Why amito? Because it's a reference to am sheitcha. Amito. Am sheitcha b'torah. Am b'torah. Mitzvot al toneu, which sounds like, and this is a little hard to fathom, but that the mitzvah to not abuse, verbal abuse, is specifically to people who keep the Torah, according to this opinion anyway, and not Jews who don't keep the Torah. Whereas ona'at mamon you can't do to anybody, but specifically ona'at varim is reserved for people who keep Torah and mitzvot. Good question why that is, and perhaps there's other ways to understand this line. Amarav, la'olam yehei adam zihir ba'onat ishtona. I quoted this yesterday in the Meiri, not realizing it comes up in the daf here. So I should have gone ahead. So Rav says, people, so this statement I quoted in the name of the Meiri was actually quoting the Gemara and then expanded on it. But people should be careful not to, now he changed the word to levayesh tishto, to humiliate your wife, but this is ba'onat ishto. Shemitoch dimata mitzuya, because since she will cry, we're going to get back to the crying, especially later in the Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkana story, her ona'ah, you will get punished for the ona'ah very quickly. And this is something we're also going to see in the next story. So basically, we're going to say the following, that you have to be careful, and we talked about this yesterday, very progressive of the rabbis really to understand that even though in those days the man maybe had a more central role, it was super important for the man to have respect for his wife. We're going to get to that also, to not abuse his wife. And here they seem to be talking about verbal abuse, which, is something in more modern times they talk about, the verbal abuse is just as bad, if not worse, than physical abuse. And that's what we're talking about here. And because she will cry, and because she cries, and because the pain for her will be so great, it will cause you to get punished quicker. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, miyom shenecharav beit hamikdash nin'alu sha'arei tefillah. Okay, we don't let you know why we're getting this, but you'll see it in the second part of the statement. From the time of the temple was destroyed, already it became harder for our prayers to get to God. Shene'emar, how do we know this? Because in Eicha, when it describes the Lamentations, gam ki ez'at v'shaveh satam tefilati. Even if I cry and beseech God, my tefillot are silenced, or they don't get anywhere. But even though the gates of prayer are closed or somewhat closed, they're not fully closed, otherwise why would we pray? But people's crying gets to God. How do we know this? Depends on how you read this pasuk, but this is an interpretation on a pasuk. Shem'at tfilati Hashem v'shavati ha'azina. Listen to my prayer, God, and hear my prayer. Okay, it's two different words to say the same thing. There's a pasuk in Tehillim. El dimati al techarash. The pshat of this means, and don't be silenced when you see my cries. Also, like a plea to God. But the way they read this in our Gemara is El dimati al techarash. This is what Rabbi Eliezer is saying, meaning you will not be silenced when you hear my cry. In other words, the beginning part is, please listen to my prayer. But when I cry, I know you won't be silent. But Amarav. Rav continues. Now, this is a little bit interesting to think about. Rav made that statement, be careful not to do ona'at to your wife and treat her properly. But then Rav says, Kol ha'olech ba'atzak ishto, get ready for this, nofel b'gehenom. If you listen to your wife's advice, don't worry, this isn't the final word yet. If you listen to your wife's advice, you will fall into Gehenom, you will go to hell. Shenema, rak lo haya ke'achav. Okay, he just wasn't like Achav. Okay, this is a pasuk in Sefer Melachim. He wasn't like Achav asher hitmaker la'asot hara b'nei Hashem asher iseta oto Izevel ishto. Izevel, his wife, Jezebel, she steered him from the path. So don't listen to wives because they'll steer you from the path. So first of all, the commentaries already say here, we don't mean don't listen to your wife. It means don't listen to your wife blindly. Don't follow what your wife says without using your own seichel, your own intelligence. This is good advice, not just for your wife, for anybody, right? But sometimes your wife might blind you and you might feel like you have to do everything she says. No, you don't. Use your own seichel, right? And again, say the same thing, wife for husband. Don't just listen to what they say, but give it some thought. But not only that, Papa says Tabai, but Nashe, people say, if your wife is short, bend down and whisper to her and basically share what you want to do, because hear what she has to say. She can give you good advice. Lo kashya. So how do we rectify this? And again, this is a classic Gemara. Could be just different approaches, or it could be listen to her. Right now we're going to see maybe listen to her in certain areas and not in other areas. What areas yes, what areas no? Good question. And whether this is still relevant today, right? Unlikely it's still relevant. Again, it's sort of dependent on the society and what women were known to have knowledge about. And also whether we need to take this. I don't think anybody really thinks we need to take this a halacha. It's just kind of saying good advice. Lo kasha habamile de alma, habamile de beta. Comes to issues in the house, so the woman knows. Trust her on that. When it comes to things outside the house, business dealings, for example, women weren't exactly business people. Now, sometimes they were, but for the majority, most of the cases, they weren't, and therefore don't necessarily take her advice on that. Lishana Achrina, some people say, habamile de shmaya, habamile de alma. And even this, there's different flipped interpretations of which is which, but the typical is to say, when it comes to things about religion, so the men know better because they sit and learn, whereas it comes to things about the world, the women know better, or might know better. Anyway, some people say it's the reverse, which is also interesting. Amar Rav Chisda. I wouldn't make too much of these statements because, again, they were statements. First of all, these answers are just an attempt to get to answers. And already there's two different versions of the answers. And there's even different versions of what these answers mean. So, take it at like that. Amar Rav Chisda. Kol ha'sharim ninalim chutz misharei ona'ah. Okay, all the gates are closed other than ona'ah. Okay, if you do ona'ah, God will see it right away and will punish you. Or if someone is humiliated by you, God sees the humiliation of people and will immediately punish. How do we know this? Adonai nitzav chomat anach ubiyado anach. And anach is a type of, it's called a plumb line, which they used to use as a plane, as a level. So God is on a chomat anach. There's a pasuk from Amos, and in his hand is an anach. So anach is spelled aleph nun, like ona'ah. So we're going to darshan that in a minute. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, akol nifra b'idei shaliach chutz mi ona'ah, shene'amar ubiyado anach. Since God has the anach in his hand, according to this pasuk, it means that God rules on cases of the anach directly. Other cases, when it comes to punishing for any other thing, God does it with a messenger. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua, shlosha ena pergonin al b'fnehem. Another similar type statement. It's 3 cases where there's no barrier between God and humans. God interacts directly. Ona'ah v'gezel v'avodah zarah. So ona'ah, theft, and avodah zarah, idol worship. Ona'ah dechtiv ubiyado anach. That's the pasuk we saw. Gezel dechtiv chamas b'shod yishama al panai tamid. There's a pasuk from Yirmiyahu. Okay, when it comes to chamas and shod, theft, robbery, will be heard always on my face, meaning I will always see it on my face, meaning no, right? It'll be direct. God says, Avodah Zarah, Dichtiv ha'ama machisimoti al panai tamid. The people who anger me, and these are Psukim in Yeshayahu, which talk about idol worship, will always be on my face, meaning I will see them always. So not behind any sort of barrier. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, la'olam yeheh adam, if we're already talking about things in the household, well, yeheza here b'tfu'ah b'toch beito. You should make sure there's always food in the house. The main thing that causes strife in the house is food. Okay, what do we mean by this? Well, first, where do we get it from? Pasuk shenemar asam gvulech shalom. You will make peace in your borders. Chelev chitim yisbiech. And the connection there is that the wheat will satiate you, and that's how you will have peace in your borders. So what does this mean? So the most likely simple explanation is that by having food, right, that means you have, right, the most struggles people probably have in their households is over money, right, and having enough money to support their families. So when there's food, have money to support your family, and you can feed the mouths of your household, you're less stressed about the money. So it's very likely we're talking about financial stress, which causes strife in the house. And that the most important thing to have is to have food in the house. I was thinking about something else that I went with my family. We went on a sabbatical on a 4-month trip to the Far East, which I've mentioned on occasion in, some vignettes here and there. Anyway, I remember on the way to the airport, my brother-in-law took us and he said to us, listen, the most important thing you need to remember is keep your kids fed, because if you keep them fed, they won't be cranky. And it was actually good advice that we weren't always able to keep so well because we didn't always have tons of food there. But anyway, it was, I definitely, in retrospect, thought, wow, that was really good advice. Because when people are hungry, right, it doesn't just mean financial issues, but if you don't eat, people get cranky and then it creates fighting in the house. So make sure to have food in your house and people will be happy. Amar Papa, Hainu de Amra Inashe, and this is what people say, when there's no more barley in the jug, Nakish va'ati tigra bebete, inner fighting starts in the house. Always make sure to have grains in your house. What makes a person called a poor person is that they don't have wheat and grains. We're talking about a psukim here. 1 second, let me just find it. Yeah. They're psukim and shoftim. Vayayim zera Yisrael. Va'ala Midyan va'amalek u'bnei kedem va'alu alav. Okay, the Midyanim and the Amalekim came and started attacking them. Vayachanu alav vayashchitu et yuvul haaretz. So the first thing they did, they destroyed all the crops. And then it says, Vayidal Yisrael ma'od mipnei Midyan. Okay, and then the Jews were poor in the eyes of the Midyanim. So here you see, without the crops, you're poor. But Amar Rabbi Chelbo, last line about the wife. La'olam yehei adam zahir b'chvod ishto. That's why I said we're going to get back to this. It's not just don't humiliate her, don't embarrass her, don't speak badly about her, but also you should always respect your wife. So to which they say, she'ein bracha mitzuyah b'toch beito shel adam ela b'shvil ishto, because your house will be blessed on account of your wife. How do we know this? Shenemar u'Avraham hitiv b'avura. When Avraham goes to Egypt, so things were good for Abraham, they say because of her, on account of his wife. And that's what Rava said to the Bnei Mechosa. You should respect your wives. Tit atru is like tit ashru. Taf and shin get switched, which means you will be wealthy. Okay, you should respect your wives, and that will bring wealth. Okay, that will bring just good things in general. I don't know if it always means, wealth that'll bring money. It's not exactly a direct connection, but it's also probably using the wealth as a way to motivate the men to do something that perhaps they weren't all doing, and the rabbis wanted them to be doing it, and encouraging them to treat their wives with respect, to not abuse their wives, etc. Okay, so our main topics were so far, okay, if we review so far what we did before we get to the second part, so we'll review this part now. We started with all these statements about how serious onat dvarim is, verbal abuse, and then we went to specifically verbal abuse for your wife. And from there, we talked about crying and how cries get to God, and therefore ona'ah causes people to cry, and therefore people will be punished for ona'ah. Whereas prayers don't always get there, but tears do, and ona'ah specifically is a sin that gets directly punished, which we're going to see from our story. Tanan hatam. So we're going to start now with this statement from a Mishnah about Tumah and Tahara. Okay, so it's our Mishnah from actually I didn't look up where the Mishnah comes up, although I should know this. Right, the Mishnah in Kalim, Perek, can't see so well. Okay, Perek. So we have a Mishnah in Kalim which talks about things that become impure, and it says, if you have an oven that was made up of pieces of cheres, earthenware, shards or pieces, V'natan chol ben chulia lechulia. It wasn't one big piece, but you had to glue it together or stick it together. You put sand in between. So the sand kind of holds it up. Rabbi Eliezer metaher v'chachamim mitami. Rabbi Eliezer says, this is not a vessel that's considered impure. And the rabbis say, what do you mean? It's a vessel, and it's a vessel that becomes impure. What the root of the debate is, there's lots of different opinions. I don't want to bring them all because it's not really our topic. We're going to get totally off on this to something else. But I'll go with Rashi, who basically explains that the sand is what's holding it together. If the sand holds it together, then it's basically a vessel made of sand, even though the main thing is really the earthenware pieces. Earthenware material is susceptible to impurity, but sand is not. It's like things made from dirt. They're not kelim that are susceptible to impurity. So basically, Rabbi Eliezer says, we rule this is based on the sand, and therefore it's not a problem. And the rabbis say, right, you can look at Rashi, okay, it's more like a building, which is, or I don't know what he means exactly by binyan, but klei glalim, which are made of dung, and klei adama, things made from dirt, are more like the ground, and they're not susceptible to impurity. And the rabbis say, no, we go by the chuliot, the pieces, which are made of cheres, which is susceptible to impurity. Okay, could be the debate is about something else. I'm not going to get into that right now. But turning now to Amud Bet, v'zehu tanor shel Achnai, and this is the oven of Achnai. Okay, the famous oven of Achnai that we have a big debate about. Right now, there's this huge debate which is going to explode soon. My Achnai, why is it called the tanor of Achnai? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, sheikifo dvarim ke'achna zo v'tim'uhu. They basically encircled like a snake, okay, that basically puts its tail in its mouth and can encircle someone. The rabbis encircled Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos like a snake and impurified him. Now, impurified the vessel, could be, or impurified him, which we're going to see. Also, they kind of brought the end of his career. Tana b'oto yom eshiv Rabbi Eliezer kol tshuvot sheba'olam v'lo kiblu imenu. So what's the scene here? The scene is we have Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos with his opinion. He's standing against all the rabbis. Now, in general, in Judaism, we hold the majority. So the rabbis have the majority opinion. Well, he starts returning, any question they ask about his opinion, he has an answer, he explains himself, but lo kiblu imenu, but they wouldn't accept any of his answers. Now, you can imagine it was pretty frustrating to him. So Amar lahem, when he gave up on the normal method of learning, which is, bringing arguments, answering questions, it didn't work. So he said, he starts to bring signs. He says, listen, if the halacha is like me, this carob tree is going to prove it. And the carob uproots itself, or the carob tree, I'm not sure, uproots itself 100 amah. And some people say 400 amah, 400 cubits, okay? In other words, all of a sudden, it just moves. And everyone, whoa, that's pretty impressive. But Amrullah, the rabbi said to him, we don't prove things from carob trees. So he says, okay, you won't prove it from a carob tree, I'll try something else. If the halach is like me, this water channel will prove. The water channel, all of a sudden the water started going in the opposite direction, right? Water always flows in one direction. So this was a clear miracle. They said, sorry, we don't bring proof from the water, from a water channel. Okay, the Maharsha, by the way, gives symbolic explanation as to why he started with the carob, then went to the water. Okay, but we're not going to get into that right now. Chazar v'amar, by the way, another thing before we continue, I want you to think about while you're reading this story is, it's a little bit similar to the very famous story in the beginning of Brachot, in the 4th chapter, about Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua. It's either Kaf Zayin or Kaf Chet in Brachot, about the story when Rabban Gamliel humiliates Rabbi Yehoshua, makes him stand up and humiliates him, and then write about the whole thing of Tfilat Arvit Reshut Chovah. And then after he humiliates him, they kick out Rabban Gamliel, they bring in Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah to be in charge, and then they go to appease Rabban Gamliel and bring him back, and whole story. There's a bunch of similarities here in terms of, the fighting, the inner fighting between the rabbis and the being very serious and about your opinions. It's interesting. Rabban Gamliel is a little bit on the other side of this one because he's against Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos. There, Rabban Gamliel was very strong about his own opinion, although maybe it's the same thing because his opinion was the majority opinion and wanted to kind of make sure that it's actually the same idea. Sorry, I got confused in my head for a minute, but it's this idea of making sure that we keep the Torah with a tradition, a clear tradition, and not have all different opinions going about and people having their own opinions. So now we're going to see Rabban Gamliel only appears kind of after the story ends, which is interesting in and of itself, but we'll get there. So now they say, Rabbi Eliezer continues. He's not finished yet. So we tried to prove from the Carib. They said we don't prove anything from a Carib. They tried to prove from the water channel. We don't prove from water channels. Amrulo, Chazar v'amar lahem. He said, listen, im halacha k'moti kotlei beit hamidrash yochichu. Look, if the halacha is like me, the walls of the Beit Midrash will prove it. He too kotlei beit hamidrash lipo. So the walls start falling. Ga'ar behem Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua gets up and says, this is too far. And by the way, it's obviously symbolic of the Beit Midrash falling apart. There's this huge battle going on, and it's going to tear apart the Beit Midrash. So Rabbi Yehoshua gets angry at the walls. Amar lahem, im talmidech hamim menatzchim ze b'halacha, atem ativchem. If you're going to have the rabbis fighting against each other in halacha, what does this have to do with you? In other words, stay out of it. And he's sort of talking to the walls, but he's really talking to God. God, stop bringing these signs. This isn't about you. This is about the rabbis. We're supposed to have discussions. We're supposed to work things out on our own. We're not supposed to have God involved. And he's going to say, and you'll see the big line in a minute or in 2 minutes. What happened to the walls? Well, lo naflu mipnei kvodo shel Rabbi Yehoshua, v'lo zakfu mipnei kvodo shel Rabbi Eliezer. Well, the walls were torn. They didn't know what to do. They wanted to respect Rabbi Yehoshua. At the same time, they wanted to respect Rabbi Eliezer. So it's like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The walls of the Beit Midrash were forever slanted because of this attempt to kind of also respect Rabbi Yehoshua and also Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus. V'adayin matim v'omdim. And they're still hanging there in midair, like the Tower of Pisa. Chazar v'amar lehem. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus pulled out everything. He's not getting anywhere. He's getting frustrated. He says, fine, God will prove from the heavens. A heavenly voice comes down from the heavens that says, Malachem Etza Rabbi Eliezer, who are you compared to Rabbi Eliezer? We pass like Rabbi Eliezer always. He's right. So heavenly voice comes down and proclaims him right. You figure the story is going to end here. Well, you probably know it doesn't. And Amad Rabbi Yehoshua Araglav Amar. So first of all, Amad Rabbi Yehoshua Araglav was the same thing in the Rabban Gamliel story. But there, he was forced to stand on his feet because out of humiliation. Here it's the opposite. He stands on his feet, stands his ground, and he says, enough. And interesting, he stands on the ground, right? It says he stands on his feet, but that means really his feet are on the ground, which is going to be important because what's Rabbi Eliezer doing? Bringing things from the heavens. And he's saying it's in the ground. And credit goes to Donna Rubenstein for pointing that out to me. And what do you see here? He says, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua Raglav Amar Lo Bashamayim. This is not in the heavens, the Torah. The Torah was given to us to interpret. My Lo Bashamayim. What does that mean? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Shekvar nitna Torah mehar Sinai. The Torah was already given at Sinai. Ein anu mashkechim bebat kol. And we don't listen to heavenly voices. Why not? Shekvar katafta bahar Sinai b'Torah. God, you already wrote in the Torah. It says, Acharei rabim lahatot. We follow majority. So God basically gave us this Torah, which is a heavenly Torah, but it's meant to be interpreted by people on the ground. This is not a Torah that lives up in the heavens, and the heavenly voices can come and decide on debates here. Okay, so now what's interesting here is, while Rabbi Eliezer might be correct, and the fact that we have all these signs showing he's correct, probably is correct, but the rabbis didn't accept any of his answers. The rabbis' logic, they couldn't understand his opinion. And because of that, they couldn't accept his opinion, despite all the signs that they saw. And that says something very deep and interesting about the Ma'arechet Halchatit, the halachic system. That even if there's mistakes in the system, and this is very beautifully written up by the Ran in Drashot HaRan, he has a drasha where he talks about this idea that it's like your body and the digestive system. And sometimes you might eat something bad, but your body digests it anyway, because if we told your body sometimes to, stop working, well, it might work at other times when you need it to work. So in order for the system to work, it has to sometimes absorb mistakes and things that are wrong, and it'll eventually go out of your system or maybe not. But there, in order for the respect for the system and for people to respect the court, we have to have this sense that even if the court makes a mistake, we have to respect the court and we have to do what the court says. If the majority, and again, the court isn't just one person, it's majority opinion of the rabbis. So the majority opinion says this, then we have to hold by. And this is a very important sugya because of the way we understand of Torah Mishamayim and, but given to us to interpret. And it's a very, very important sugya. But what's it doing here in the sugya of Ona'at Dvarim? If you look in the context, and this is something, if you learned this story, you probably learned it outside of the context of Bava Metzia and outside the context of our sugya. So the question is, what is it doing here? So anyway, we haven't finished the story yet. There's a kind of add-on stuff here. So the first thing add-on is Amar Eshkachei Rabbi Natan Eliyahu. So Rabbi Natan finds Eliyahu and Navi, and he says to him, Amarle, my Avi Kadosh Baruch Hu Bahishata. I want to know what was going up in the heaven. What was going on in the heavens when God saw this whole thing go about? Amarle Kachiyech va'amar. There's the famous line. God was smiling and said, Nitzchuni banai, Nitzchuni banai. Now, Nitzchuni generally means, and we saw it before, Minatzchim zeh zeh. They were kind of fighting against each other or trying to beat each other. Nitzachon is a victory. They triumph, right? My sons triumphed over me. Like saying, I gave them something and they took it somewhere else entirely. And you know what? That's their triumph. Some people explain it as eternal. Netzach is also eternal. And this makes the Torah eternal. It's a beautiful way of interpreting it because this means the Torah will be eternal because it will always be given to every generation to interpret. And that's a beautiful idea about the development of halacha, the development of tradition, and how that is what makes it eternal. But the story continues. Well, anything that went in that oven that Rabbi Eliezer had said is impure, is pure, and the rabbis think it's impure. Well, they had to basically deem everything that went in those kind of ovens impure, and they burnt all those things. And the second thing they did is they took a vote and they excommunicated him. Okay, whether severe excommunication, less severe excommunication, doesn't really matter, but they excommunicate him. And then they said, well, who's going to go and inform him? By the way, the same version of who's going to go comes up in the story with Rabban Gamliel also, who's going to go and appease him. So, and Rabbi Akiva appears there as well. Amar lahem Rabbi Akiva ani elech. So Rabbi Akiva says, I'm going to go. This is very sensitive. We have to be careful how we tell him because he's a very powerful person. He could destroy the whole world, or his anger could destroy the world. So Ma'aseh Rabbi Akiva lavash chorim v'nitatev chorim. He dressed in black. He covered himself in black. Yashav lefanav b'richuk arba amot. He stayed 4 cubits away from him, which is what you do. You can't come within 4 cubits of someone who's in cherem, excommunicated. Amarlo Rabbi Eliezer, Akiva, ma yomi yomayim. What's different today than yesterday? Amarlo Rebbe, himidumeli. It seems to me. Okay, again, trying to soften the blow. Your friends are separating themselves from you. Afu kara b'gadav. So what was his reaction? He tore kriya, right? He tears his clothes. That's what you do when you're excommunicated. V'chalatz min alav. You're not allowed to wear shoes. So he took his shoes off. V'nishmat v'yashav al gabei karka. And he went and sat on the ground. It sounds like Tisha B'Av, right? Zalgu einav dma'ot. Here come back the tears. He starts to cry. Yeah, very tragic. What was the immediate reaction? What did we learn? When you cry, God hears right away. Well, lakah ha'olam shlish b'zeitim, shlish b'chitim, shlish b'sorim. 1/3 of the olives in the world were wiped out. 1/3 of the wheat in the world were wiped out, and 1/3 of the barley was wiped out. Okay, that's how tragic this was, and how much. Now, what do you see here? That what they did. Now, it's interesting. It sounds like, to a certain extent, it was wrong. Because look what happened. This is ona'ah. They caused verbal abuse to him. It's not exactly verbal abuse. It's a little, not exactly ona'ah. But again, ona'ah is a loose definition. Definitely causing someone to be embarrassed. Some people say, all the doughs that the women were making, instead of rising, it all went flat. Tana. And some people say it's af instead of ach. Let's read it as af gadol haya ba'oto hayom. There was a huge anger that day. Shebachol makom shenatam bo'einav Rabbi Eliezer nischat. Anywhere Rabbi Eliezer looked was burned, right? Because he was so angry with what had happened. Va'af Rabban Gamliel. Now he was the head of the Beit Midrash. We didn't see him in the story at all. We saw Rabbi Yehoshua. We saw Rabbi Akiva. We didn't see him at all. Maybe he was away. Maybe that's why he was on a boat. But somehow he knew what had happened. You can see maybe he left on the boat after this happened. Rabban Gamliel is often on boats. He was coming back in a boat. Amar alav nachshol tavo, and a gale comes up and wants to sink the boat. Amal, he realizes why. Kimidumeli she'ein ze'ela b'shvir Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkelus. It must be because of the excommunication we did, and now I'm going to get punished for it. Amar raglav Amal, he stood up and he said, Ribono shel olam. He speaks to God, right? This is like out of Yonah, and he speaks to God and he says, I didn't do this for my own kavod. Not for the name of my forefathers. He was from a family of Messian. This isn't a personal vendetta. He says, here he says, this is what I said before, I didn't want there to be divisiveness within the Jewish people. And that's why I did it. God is convinced, and the water calms down. Now the story continues. Ima Shalom, who we're going to meet right now, Debitu de Rabbi Eliezer, she was Rabbi Eliezer's wife, who happened to also be Achnai de Rabban Gamliel. Okay, now she's got in a tricky position. She's in between these two people who are in this huge fight, and she's scared that Rabbi Eliezer is so strong and burning everything, he's going to cause the death of Rabban Gamliel, which almost happened. So she was the sister of Rabban Gamliel, Havai. She would never let him do tachanun. Tachanun comes right after Shmona Esrei. Some people, the Ritva tries to prove from here why it has to be right after Shmona Esrei, because that's when your prayers are heard the most. It's like a plea of, almost like I'm down in the depths and I need your help, God. Okay, it's a very beautiful prayer. And it's really like a time right after davening that God will hear you. So she says, I can't let this happen. So what does she do? Every day she wouldn't let him. Okay, so that's why the Ritva says, what do you mean she wouldn't let him? He could do it any time later, but she wouldn't let him do it right after he finished Shmona Esrei, because that's like the best time where your prayers will be heard. Yoma, but there was one day, Reish Yarcha Have, it was Rosh Chodesh, but she got confused. It was the 30th, which really wasn't Rosh Chodesh. She thought it was Rosh Chodesh. Really, Rosh Chodesh was the next day because it was a full month. And in those days, they didn't do 2 days like we do. And she thought there wasn't Tachanun. Here we also learn that you don't do Tachanun on Rosh Chodesh. So Ika de Amre, some people say it wasn't that. And then she wasn't paying attention because she didn't think it was going to say Tachanun anyway. Or Ata Anya Vakaya Bava, or a poor person came and knocked on the door exactly at that moment. Afika le Rifta, she went to give him bread. And when she came back, Eshkache de Nafil al Ape, she saw that he was doing Tachanun and it was too late. Amra le Kum, she says, get up. You killed my brother. Adahachi, in the meanwhile, Nafak Shipura Mibeit Rabban Gamliel Deshachiv. In fact, it was true. What she said was true. They get a word that Rabban Gamliel is dead. Amar Lei. Rabbi Eliezer turns to her and says, Menayadat, how do you know? Amra Lei, by the way, you see also the wife and her advice, and she understands what's supposed to be done. Amra Lei, Kach Mekuvlani Mibeit Aviyab, I learned from my father's house. This is what we saw before. All the gates are closed except for the gates of Ona'ah. Those prayers will come through, and God saw that you were upset and punished my brother. Okay, tragic. So the question is, right, and in this book I've mentioned before, Fresh Fruit and Vintage Wine of Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, he asked the question, like, okay, so in the end, who is right? And it's actually tricky, he says, because on the one hand, you have Rabban Gamliel, who convinces God that he did it for the right reasons. On the other hand, he gets killed in the end. So it's very tricky to understand, like, who's right and who's wrong. So he brings first Rabbi Akiva Eger, who says that, that it could be that they were allowed to put him in excommunication. But just because you're allowed to do something doesn't mean you should do it. And I thought that this connected nicely with this idea of lifnim mishurat hadin that we've been talking about in the Masechet. Sometimes there's the law, but then you don't always have to keep the law exactly as it says. And maybe they went too far. Maybe they really shouldn't have done that. And he proves it from in Ta'anit Kaf Gimel, the story of Choni Amalgel. If you remember, Shimon ben Sheta says, how are you talking to God that way, right? When he says, oh, you brought too much rain. And he's like, who are you to talk to God like that? But then he sees that God actually listens to him. And then he realizes, well, who am I to say that, he's wrong? So, and he doesn't excommunicate him. And maybe that's what they should have done here, because also Rabbi Eliezer and Horganus did have signs from God. So maybe they went too far. But Yitzchak Blau suggests something very interesting. He says, maybe they did the right thing. But even when you make decisions, you have to understand what the ramifications of your decisions are. And you have to realize that, okay, maybe excommunication was the right thing to do, because otherwise he was going to keep ruling in his way and going against the rabbis. But by the way, connects with the whole Zakei Mamre Sugur, which we're going to see in Sanhedrin. But he says that you have to understand and look ahead at what are the ramifications of this, though, and how can I balance that out? And how can we somehow, even though we're excommunicating, how can we somehow find respect for him? And he uses it as an analogy for things we do in life, that you have to think about. Sometimes you do the right thing, but there are negative ramifications, and you have to figure out and balance that and try to counterbalance it with doing something to fix that issue that comes up as a result of your action. So it's something to think about, and particularly in this, and that's why I think this comes up in Onat Varim. First of all, it comes up because that was, they pained him, but also to understand that sometimes, people say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and you have to correct them, and you have to make a public statement about it possibly, but you also have to balance that with understanding what this will do to the person and how much pain it will cause them, and figure out how to balance that properly. So very interesting story. We're going to now move on and finish our daf. Tanu Rabbanan, a bright reads. We're now going back to the issue of the convert. Okay, and by the way, much has been written about this, academic articles, Torah journals, articles galore. You can search and look up and find lots and lots of things written about it. Daf Yomi, we don't have time. You could spend probably months just on this topic. And we'll get to similar things that cross over when we get to Zakei Mamre and Sanhedrin about the halachic system and what if there's mistakes, and are there ever mistakes? Do we believe there's never mistakes? Do we believe there could be mistakes, or does it just look to us like it's a mistake, but maybe we're wrong? Anyway, that's a whole other question, which relates to this. Tanu Rabbanan, if you do ona'ah, verbal abuse to a ger, there's 3 transgressions, 3 negative transgressions. Halochatzo, if you do it in money areas, over b'shnayim, only 2. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? And then they try to find which 3. V'ger lo toneh, okay, that's clear. That's ger and lo ona'ah. V'lo tonu ishat amito, well, that's just to everybody. And ger b'chlal amito, and a ger is part of everybody. So lo chatzo nami shlosh aktive, but lo chatzo, you said there were only 2, but there's really 3, because lo tilchatzenu, which is said about the ger lo tilchatz, which is the same thing, and then it says v'lo tielo kinoshet, and this is just to everybody. V'ger b'chlal, this is don't push someone to pay you back money. If someone owes you money, don't force them all the time and say, give me back my money, give me back my money. That's lochotz, and when it comes to to pressure someone, when it comes to oppress someone, when it comes to money issues, and that includes the ger. So ela echad zev echad zev b'shlosha. So in the end, they conclude it must be both have 3. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Gadol Omel Mipnei Ma, and by the way, Rabbi Eliezer Gadol is Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus that we had before. Mipnei Ma is Hira Torah b'lamed vav mekomot v'amrela b'mem vav mekomot beger. Why does it say 36 times in the Torah, or some people say 46? What the difference comes from? So Tosfot suggests that could be because when it says ki gerim hayitem, which is the explanation for the ger, so the word ger is mentioned twice in the same context, we count that as 2. If you say 46. 36 or 46 times, either which way, it's an insane amount of times of how to treat a ger. Because the ger might easily turn back. And we have to be extra careful to ensure that we treat converts properly so that they don't turn back to their ways, and we keep them within, right? Our goal is not to say, oh, you converted, we don't really want you as part of our community. The opposite, we have to bring them in, and to that extent, to make sure that we treat them properly so that they don't leave. Why does it mention because you were also converts? Right? If you have a blemish in you, don't say it to somebody else, right? That's a classic, right? Don't try to, we're all gerim, so therefore don't try to say, oh, you're a convert. We're converts too. Or we were strangers in a strange land. We know what it feels like, okay? It's not that we're converts, but we understand what it's like to be an outsider, and therefore never treat someone else like they're an outsider. Last line for today. This is very interesting. If someone has someone in their family that was hung, don't say to them, hang the fish. Because just saying, it's a fascinating way to end the section, just saying, hang the fish reminds them of the hanging of their relative. So, put it on a hook. Don't say the word hang, because that will make them remember, and that will make them sad. And that's so far about how you have to be careful about not to say something to somebody, which might, right? This is basically saying we demand a high level of sensitivity. Now, you don't always know, but if you know something about someone, be very careful and think about how you're going to speak to them, what you're going to say. And this, comes up a lot in our lives. To be sensitive to other people and know what the right thing to say is, so as not to upset them in any way, even by saying something that's not even insulting. but just might make them upset. With that, we will end our daf. We don't really need a review of this section of the daf because it wasn't like a back and forth. It was just this fascinating story. And with that, gives us a lot of food for thought over this holiday and over Shabbat. So Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Moadim l'simcha.